good evening. This is the India Development Debate. I'm Taneia Bhardwaj coming to you live from our Mumbai studios. And let's start with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who seems to be on an overdrive in a bid to revive animal spirits in the economy. The Prime Minister today announced a 12-point program to pump prime small and medium enterprises that are facing acute liquidity crunch. Topping the chart is a 59-minute loan disbursal plan, which Modi hailed as the next game changer. Also, GST-compliant MSMEs will get a 2% interest rate rebate, while exporters have been promised higher incentives. The announcements are coming at a time when the India government is really facing a lot of flack for not doing enough to boost growth. The ongoing slugfest with the RBI may have only worsened the situation, although Modi today clarified that his government is committed to its flagship slogan of minimum government, maximum governance. No doubt, small and medium firms form the heart of the economy, and any effort to lift their fortunes must be celebrated. But the big question is, will the measures announced today help revive the MSME segment? Well, the Prime Minister's MSME pep talk is the topic of our discussion this evening on the India Development Debate. And for that, we've got three special guests joining in. Rajat Kathuria, Director and Chief Executive with the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. We've got Ashok Sehgal, he chairs the CII National MSME Council. And our very own consulting editor, Maithili Pusnurmat, is here with us this evening as well. All three of you, good evening, and thank you so much for taking the time out. Maithili, let me begin by asking you, what have you made of the Prime Minister's 12-point program to basically pump prime small and medium enterprises? Is it the much needed boost to kickstart the MSME sector, you think?
Well, it certainly is a good initiative, but it is better headlines, because the fact remains, Tanya, is that how good are we at translating it to action on the ground? That's always been our Achilles heel. Implementation is almost an impossible task in India, and given the limited time before the government, I'm not sure how much of it will really translate into action on the ground. And this 59-minute loan sounds very good, but targeted lending is never a very good idea. Of course, there are some safeguards, as in, it's only those MSMEs which are on the GST portal, etc., which have ITR returns. So there is some kind of safeguard to ensure that at least documentation for these MSMEs is in order. But targeted lending, frankly, is really never a good idea, and whether we will be able to do it, I really have my doubts. But having said that, yes, it is a good initiative, because as you said, it is the MSME sector that really contributes not just to growth, but more importantly, employment. So let's see how much of this actually, as I said, really works out, because ultimately the answer is to ensure that there is better ease of doing business in the country, not just for the larger corporates, but also for the small and medium scale. And that is always still something that we are looking for answers in that area.
Mr. Kathuria, before we drill it down to specifics, let me get you a broad, comment as well. To what extent do you think some of these measures, the 12-point agenda, for 100 days, help address the problem of the MSME sector that contributes to nearly 30% of our GDP?
No, I completely agree with what Maithili has just said. This is a good initiative, no doubt about that, and it comes at the background of a liquidity crunch, especially faced by small and medium enterprises. Yes. Any situation when you have a liquidity crisis or working capital problem, the industry that tends to get crowded out as a result of facing disproportionately high cost of credit, facing high costs of doing business, and also facing higher risks. So this will alleviate, I think, one of the problems, which is the credit constraint, and it won't address the problem for all SMEs, but for some SMEs, it will certainly address the liquidity problem. But there are so many other problems that medium and small enterprises face in India, the other structural problems which we've spoken about so many times. And I think those are many more long-term issues. Recently, we heard that India moved up 23 places in the ease of doing business. And I think it is those measures that will be really helpful for SMEs to do what they're supposed to be doing in terms of forming the backbone of the economy, not only contributing to growth, but as Maithili said, contributing to one of India's biggest problems in the current development scenario, which is creating productive jobs. Most of our jobs are really in the informal sector and don't produce as much as we think they should. So, and SMEs are really the backbone for economies to to provide that productive employment to help growth in employment and labor intensive employment. And those issues I think will be addressed in a much more sort of structural way. We've begun to ease the costs of doing business on small and medium enterprises, but in the larger scheme of things, it's always, I think, on many dimensions, it's the micro, it's the small and medium enterprises that tend to get crowded out, whether it is as a result of higher costs of borrowing, but costs of doing business also disproportionately fall on the small and medium enterprises. So this is a good move, but it has to be seen in a larger context, and many other things need to be done to alleviate all the problems that they face.
Okay. Mr. Sehgal, let me ask you, and I'll sort of take off from where Mr. Katuria left off. Right now, it's the liquidity crunch that's standing out as the biggest challenge for the sector. The Prime Minister today has said that loans of up to 1 crore will be disbursed within 59 minutes via this MSME portal. How much of a game changer can it be? Because I'm wondering what the response from the sector is, because it's highly informal and you'll have to go through a tech process.
I think what Mr. Katuria touched on is really important. He mentioned, and I would like to broaden the scope of what we're talking about, SME.
Yes.
The current definition is MSME, medium and micro, small and medium enterprises. And I think this specific point you referred to of 1 crore is targeted to make things easier for the micro sector. Now, the micro sector, you have correctly said, has constraints of technology, but I think they are being overplayed. I think the micro sector will come up, and the side benefit of what we're seeing will be that they will come into the formal economy, which will enable the government to make more policies in their favor. As far as the lending to them is concerned, I think the thing is that now the algorithm which the banks will use is a very welcome step. They're integrating data from different silos, which is a term as the PM used, and Mr. Modi is very right in saying that that is a game changer, and we hope it extends across the economy, because you're now not only collecting data by the government, but using that data for decision making. And I think the 3 criteria they've laid down are very, very reasonable. There is your GST return to say how much turnover you have. There's the income tax to say whether it's profitable, and the bank has its own records of your cash dealings, how your cash flows work out. Now, as opposed to that, my feelings in the past, what really the banks did was that they looked at your collateral, they looked at whether they liked you as an entrepreneur, and then they granted the loan without looking at your business plan. This will force banks to look at the business plan and make investments where they are required for producing good results. So I think that is a game changer. The other thing, as Mr. Katuria mentioned, is the whole subject of ease of doing business.
Yes.
If MSMEs are getting attention at the highest level in the country, I'm sure that all these steps will result in a lot of ease of doing business, and a lot of micro and small enterprises shy away from coming into the formal sector, not because they don't want to pay taxes, not because they want to be out of sight of the government, but because it is just too difficult to cope with all the compliance requirements. So this will enable people or encourage people to come into the formal sector, benefiting themselves and the government.
Okay. Maithili, the other action point, so to speak, is GST registered MSMEs will get 2% rebate on, the interest on loans. How much of an incentive is this going to be, you think, for the sector?
Well, interest subvention should make some difference, because MSMEs always end up paying a higher rate of interest than the larger corporates. But the question is that interest subvention really hurts the banks, because very often government does not, pay their share of that interest to the banks. So you're basically, robbing Peter to pay Paul. Ultimately, it is important that MSMEs become more efficient, and these measures that the government is taking should help towards that larger goal. But interest subvention in itself will not really materially change things very much, because ultimately at the end of the day, banks must be willing to lend, and that is where the question really arises, that even if you give that sanction, in principle sanction, there's still a catch, because banks will have to verify the documents and ensure that the business plan you know, they're satisfied with that. So it's one thing to give it in principle, another thing to actually translate it into action and disperse the loan. So there are a number of question marks that still remain to be addressed. But the fact is, as I said, this is a good initiative. We have to see how much the government is able to follow through with the banks and with the MSME sector, because a great deal depends on them also, because they have to be part of the GST portal. So in fact, this encourages them to be part of the GST portal. And as Mr. Sehgal said, to the extent that it brings them into the formal sector, it's good for the industry, it's good for the employees, it's good for the economy, and of course for government as a tax recipient.
Mr. Kathuria, you know, the government is also going to raise interest concession on loans for MSME exporters to 5% from the 3%. But given we are only talking about a 100-day time frame here, is it really going to ease the burden at all?
I mean, for exports, again, as I said earlier as well, you know, exports is a continuous process of becoming competitive.
Yes.
And a change in the interest rate paid for exporters also is going to have a minor effect. I mean, there's so many other things that affect exports, and SMEs in India haven't been really, you know, very good at becoming competitive and reaching the export market. There have been some success stories, but by and large, the micro and small and medium enterprises, which ought to be the backbone really of exports to the rest of the world, they haven't really performed as well as the larger enterprises in India have performed. And the economic survey touched on this last year, that most of India's exports are by, you know, 1% of the firms contribute about 38% of the exports. So on the export front, given the lack of competitiveness, due to a whole, you know, host of reasons, including I would say the volatility in exchange rate. Normally one would say that the exchange rate depreciates, so you should find you know, it cheaper to export and exporters would become more competitive. But you know, we haven't seen that happen in the past. The exchange rate impact on exports has been very small because of the other handicaps. And so the interest rate sort of subvention and the interest rate concession is also like a price impact. Right? If the exchange rate impact has not been very large to exporters in general, and in particular to the micro and small and medium enterprises, then interest rate changes also, I would expect, that wouldn't have too much of an impact on exports. I think yes. If one were to you know, draw an analogy from what Mr. Sehgal was also saying, is that if we were to improve trade facilitation and improve the quality of facilitation both at our land ports and our seaports, where a lot of you know, handicap happens, where a lot of transactions costs get incurred, a lot of delays happens. If we improve that, then I think in terms of bang for the buck for small and medium enterprises, that would have much more of a, you know, positive impact on export performance.
Okay, Mr. Sehgal, the other point is about, you know, PSUs with the turnover of above 500 crore will be registered under TREDS to basically ensure that small businesses get credit based on trade receivables. Do you see this ensuring at least a steady stream of cash flow for them?
I think it should work well, because I think the public sector units in one way or the other are the source of a lot of delayed payments, whether the MSME sector is directly supplying to the PSUs, or quite often you may be supplying through an intermediary like an EPC contractor. But what ends up happening is that if the prime contractor doesn't get paid on time, his cash flows get affected and he has to also squeeze you at the other end. The other point is, I'm not very clear on this, and perhaps maybe I misheard what was said, is that I think this necessity of everybody over 500 crores compulsory coming onto TRED may be also applicable to the private sector, not just the public sector units, but I would be open to a correction on that. So I think if that happens, then that is a very, very big game changer.
Maithili, you know, the Modi government also, by bringing in an ordinance to amend the Companies Act, has sort of recategorized 16 of the 81 compoundable offences from the jurisdiction of special courts to in-house e-adjudication frameworks. Do you think this will also provide the much required solace from, you know, legal wrangling that often comes the MSME's way?
Yeah, given the way that we have, cases piling up in courts, and given the extraordinary delays that we see within the legal system, this should help. But once again, we'll have to see whether they have sufficient infrastructure, because very often we pass best of laws. Of course, ideally, in fact, there should not have been an ordinance at all. But I suppose the government feels that there was an urgency. Ordinances should be resorted to only in extreme circumstances, because they're basically bypassing Parliament. But having said that, perhaps the government feels that there is an urgent requirement right now to ease the tensions and the pressures on the MSME sector. But ideally, I think we also need to, whenever you pass laws, also ensure that we have the infrastructure in place. But given the fact that legal wranglings take so much of time, and the MSME sector once again doesn't have the resources to fight these cases in court for such a long period of time, I think this again is a very good initiative. So a number of good initiatives. Let's see how far we're able to see that this gets translated, implemented, because as I said, implementation has always been our biggest, weakest link.
Mr. Kathura, let me ask you, one of the other announcements the Prime Minister was sort of harping on is that inspections of all factories in the sector will now be only sanctioned through a computerized random allotment, and inspectors will have to upload their reports on that portal within 48 hours. How crucial is this, you think?
No, I think this is a very good initiative, and this was something similar that was done for labor inspections also. They were randomized. And I think this is a good initiative because, as I've been saying, the small and medium enterprises really face the brunt of the transactions costs or the inspections, or if you would call it rent seeking from the part of the inspectors. And if this happens, if it's randomized and if they're not going to check everybody, then I think it is good news for the sector. But one will have to see and how the SMEs and the micro enterprises respond to it, because they need to have, as Maithili was saying, the infrastructure to be able to upload the documents on the portal. The document need to be, clean and compliant. And if they ensure all that, and if that trust is being able to create it between the government and the small scale sector, I think this will go a long way in reducing the costs of doing business, which, as we know, disproportionately fall on the small guys, on the small and medium enterprises. So if anything that is able to reduce their costs of doing business will make them more competitive. Interest rates will of course help them, but I think it's the larger sort of environment, the ecosystem in which they operate. They don't know, which part of the law is going to fall on them when in an uncertain environment. Now it becomes a little more certain. Technology is going to come to the rescue. There will be randomized checks. And hopefully the costs of business will eventually fall when the system becomes easier for both the government and for the enterprises to use, and they begin to trust each other. Then I think this is good news. And this should be, spread across, all dimensions of government interaction with industry, not only for the small and medium enterprises, but this inspection done through technology, done in a randomized way, where enforcement is quick and it's smooth and efficient, so that it also provides a deterrent effect for other, run-by-night operators or fly-by-night operators, so that then the law is there and it gets implemented by everybody, and the costs eventually will fall. So this is a good step, I think.
Mr. Sehgal, many of these measures, it's a clear indication that the government is trying to sort of formalize this sector. Formalization, of course, is, a good thing for the economy, but for a sector like MSMEs, which has been traditionally informal and unorganized, how fast do you think this sector is going to be able to adapt and, accept this invitation, so to speak?
Yeah, before I answer that question, if I might have your indulgence,
please.
I want to get back to the point of inspections. You see, one of the points which we from industry are suggesting to the government is that with all the data available with the government, the old Inspector Raj of the people walking into your office and saying, produce these records and those records, should be over. It should be possible for them to sit in their own office, download all the data which the government has collected, go through everything, and then come back with a specific point, and only after they've spotted something specific in their office should they be allowed to visit and disturb the working of the industry itself. So I think that's a suggestion which we are pressing with the government, that there is no need for the inspector to come in most cases. Now, coming back to your point about the formal sector, I have a somewhat positive attitude about the IT savviness of the small people in India who are running small enterprises. Even the unskilled workers today are quite adept at transferring their funds home through the local internet system rather than going through a bank. And I think in the same way, the GST returns now, there will be service outlets, much like we had in the old days, the data centers. You could go to a computer center and access the internet. I think there are a lot of these I see in villages and smaller towns, and I think people will begin to use these and use their services and get used to it, provided they, at the end of it, they see a benefit of doing so. And I think the list of benefits which the Prime Minister has listed out should make people feel, and I hope their advisors would tell them, that there are definite benefits. One of the questions, for example, was that why should an MSME register itself with the MSME ministry? I think one of the answers today, which somebody can unequivocally say, is that if you register there, you'll get a 2% rebate on your interest rate.
Yeah.
So here's something which is on the table and visible and realizable. Okay. And I think these kind of incentives will go a long way in encouraging people. I do believe that people want to comply, they want to fall in line, and if you reduce the hurdles, as these schemes will do, we will get them coming to the formal sector and benefiting from it.
Right. Maithili, it's a sector that employs 12 crore people. It contributes more than 40% in, total exports. And yet it seems that at least what we've seen today, labor and production, two of the sort of backbones of this industry, structural issues in terms of those areas and long-term solutions have been left wanting. They continue to remain unaddressed, isn't it?
Well, yeah, that's very true. You're entirely right. And in fact, if you compare with the OECD countries where the MSME sector contributes 50% of GDP, we still have enormous potential. And given that the bulk of these units are in fact in the informal sector, it's very imperative that we get them into the formal sector. But Taneia, the fact is that, even though we talk about, and Mr. Sehgal mentioned how even in the smaller cities and smaller interior areas, people are very much more net savvy than before, the fact is that even in larger cities like Delhi and Bombay, we've seen how patchy connectivity is. So it's all very well to aim very high, but we also need to get the nuts and the bolts correct, and I think that's why government was focused on. Aim high, but at the same time get down and dot your I's and cross your T's and ensure that basic things are in place, and then I think we will get progress.
Right. Very quickly, Mr. Kathuria, I have time for one last question. And since Maithili said Mumbai and Delhi, India has improved 23 places in the ease of doing business, but the ranking is based only on the ground situation in two cities, which is Mumbai and Delhi. With the bulk of MSMEs operating out of tier 2 and tier 3 cities, would you say that some of the government's reforms are just absolutely bypassing these businesses?
Well, I mean, you could make a case on that, and in terms of the institutional structure of the government, federal, center, state, and even city, the municipal corporations, etc. You would see that we need to do, once you have a policy at the center level, it needs to actually get implemented at the level of the state and move down in certain cases to the level of the city or the wards, etc. And I think improvement there will come, but it will come over a period of time. So the premise of your question, I think, I don't have data to support that, but I think the premise of your question is correct, and that we should try and reduce the costs of business at the state level and at the local level. Having said that, let me make one more point, which is, I think, pertinent to the debate that we are having today. And it's good that we are focusing on the small and the micro sector. The world over, as Maithili also said, it's this sector which is the backbone for the economy, both in terms of providing employment as well as providing exports and GDP. But you would also notice that if you do a comparison of small enterprises across countries, you will see that eventually some of them become very large and become very big. And that's been the case with most other countries, including in China. The time it takes for Indian small and medium enterprises, because innovation is really a sort of happens and takes place within these small enterprises. You may want to sort of romanticize it and say that it happens in these garage startups, and eventually some of them become big. The time it takes for Indian small and medium enterprises, those who are successful, to become big and thereby, become very large contributors to employment and growth, it takes a very long time for Indian enterprises to grow big. Within the same, it takes 1/5 time, for example, in China for these enterprises to become big. And therein lies the structural problem. So your interest rate and your price incentives will provide, short-term solace or short-term succor, but it's really the structural changes within the enterprises and what you were saying about ease of doing business at the state and at the city level. Those will really drive these enterprises to become big. And we should aim to make these enterprises large so that, they will be replaced by new startups, at the bottom of the pyramid.
All right, I'm afraid we're completely out of time. Thank you, each one of you, Maithili Pusturmat, Rajat Katuria and Ashok Sehgal, for taking the time out. So it's a Diwali gift, all right, for the MSMEs, but it's implementation that's clearly going to be the key. With that, we wrap it up, at least on this discussion.